All right, so I'm going to come back. Huh?
The class division.
Oh, yeah, it's class number 14. 14. I'm going to come back to this thought in just a moment. But before we get away from it, I want to take and expand a little more on this idea of the distinction in male and female, because what you have in chapter 1 of Genesis is a broad picture of creation, kind of the zoomed out picture. In chapter number 2, you have it zoomed in, right? And chapter number 2 begins with the seventh day. God rested, and then it talks about the generations of the heavens and of the earth, and how God did these things, but He really zooms in verse number 6 and 7 on that sixth day again, on man. God formed man of the dust of the ground. So now He's giving a more detailed explanation. So it's like more of a micro versus macro explanation. And then He describes where He's placed in the garden there. And then God begins to establish, He begins to establish principles of distinction between Adam and Eve, man and woman, male and female. And this goes to the foundational biblical understanding that there is a distinction between the sexes and that there are gender roles. Okay, and we'll talk about this question of what is gender and this whole, there's a spectrum and there's this and that. We'll talk about that here in a while. But understand from a biblical view, biblical perspective, there are distinctions in the roles given to male and female. Okay? And He begins in verse number 15, and it says He took the man specifically, right? The man. So here's the establishment of a role for the male. Put him in the garden, distinction, to dress and keep it. He gives him a physical responsibility. And then not only does He give him physical responsibilities there, but in verse 16 and 17, He gives him moral responsibilities. That of being a moral leader.
What verse?
Verse 15 is a physical responsibility. Verse 16 and 17 are the moral responsibilities. Verse number 18, He introduces the female into the narrative and gives a distinct role for the female, that of help. And I want to, sometimes we wrongly say help mate. That's not what the Bible says here. Help, I will make and help meet for him. And the word meet here, M-E-E-T, is the word suitable, appropriate. A help. So he needs help. He's got a important physical responsibility, and he has an important moral responsibility, and he needs help in it. Now, please grasp this reality. The Bible elevates women to a position that the world without the Bible never does. I mean, listen, these folks that say, the Bible makes women servants and the Bible makes these people are just absolutely ignorant and foolish.
Absolutely.
Look at any part of the world where the Bible is not. Women are slaves. Women are downtrodden and dominated everywhere in the world where the Bible is not. It is the presence of the Bible and the elevation in the Bible of a woman as a co-helper, joint heir, that elevated women in Western society. Women in Western society have more rights than any place in the world women have ever lived. So to say that the Bible somehow is sexist and all this, it's just asinine. It's asinine. It's foolishness at the highest level. She is a help meet for him, suitable, acceptable for the responsibility to help him accomplish the responsibilities he has been given. But notice the distinction here. He is placed in a leadership role and she is placed in a help role. Now, if you understand authority from a biblical view, then you understand the significance of that role. Because the job of a leader from a Bible perspective is to make the followers glorious. When Christ in Ephesians is illustrated as the head and the husband is told to follow the example of Christ, it says of him that he sanctified and cleansed his bride with the washing of the water by the word, that he may present unto himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that it should be holy and without blemish. So ought men to love their wives. Meaning that God's view of leadership is vastly different. The Bible view of leadership is vastly different from an unbiblical view that is present where mankind is without God and the influence of His Word. Jesus even points this out in the Gospels when He says the Gentiles exercise lordship, and their great men exercise dominance, lordship over others. But that was not going to be so with you. Whosoever be chiefest among you, let him be the servant of all. This is God's view of leadership. Right leadership is a servant position. And it makes those that are below that authority to be elevated, to be lifted up, to be made glorious. A husband that's being like Christ is making his wife glorious. Now tell me how it is that that's bad for her. His emphasis is to be that, to help her to become the best version of herself that she can possibly be. That's what leadership is about. But we don't want that. You know what we want? We want a woman to have to go to work and work like a man, stink like a man, look like a man, and come home. And I'm not against women working. I think women work hard, whether they have a job outside the home or not. Women are hard workers. But there's a natural role God wanted a man to take and a natural role God wanted a woman to take, and it isn't to make her less of a person. It's to help him see the necessity of being the leader that God wants him to be and set an example of how God is with us. So there's that responsibility that's placed upon us. Then, and we could go on, and I don't think there's a need to this, but in verse 22 of chapter 2, he talks about bringing the woman to the man, and Adam's recognition of the companionship that she is. She was called woman because she was taken out of man, but she was taken from the side of man, right? Not his foot, not his head, the side. She's a companion. Womb. is the word woman is denoting the womb that a woman has. That's where the concept or word comes from. She is the womb bearer of mankind. And he denotes in verse 24 the priority that she's to have. He shall leave father and mother and cleave to his wife. Right? So she's to have priority in his life. From the very beginning, God says these things. And then there's the intimacy discussed in verse 25. They were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed. There should be no shame within the marriage. But then we see the fall in chapter 3, and in the fall, we see a greater than distinction given between the man and the woman, in that responsibilities become magnified with pain and the problems that are associated with certain responsibilities, both in labor for the man and in childbirth for the woman. Things become more difficult because of sin, right? But God doesn't abolish the natural roles that were given here in these verses and that are consistent throughout the Scriptures. So my point in all of this discussion is to say this, that God from the beginning wanted there to be distinction both in the role and in the presentation of men and women, and so he presents it in that fashion. The role of taking responsibility and leadership, and the role of being a help and a companion, and then the man seeing that help and companion and saying, I will cleave to her, I will pursue her, right? And then becoming joint heirs together of the grace of life. So all of that's presented in the book of Genesis in the first 2 chapters. So we see God's distinction clearly. Now, as you go throughout the Scriptures and you see God discuss this further, in Matthew 19, he reiterates this. He answered and said in Matthew 19:4, have you not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female? That's distinction. Man and woman, male and female. This is where we get the terms masculine and feminine. That is, the attributes of the male, the attributes of the female. And we'll come back to that more distinctly later, but that is the foundational principle or concept of gender. But when we talk about sexuality, you need to understand that this is a conversation that literally 100 years ago was completely different than it is today. It wasn't until the 1500s that the term sex was introduced into the English vocabulary. And it actually comes from 2 different root words. The one word is the root word of six, and the other is divide. You get that? I don't mean did you write it, I mean did you get it? Do you understand that?
Not quite. Okay. One more time.
One word where the word sex comes from, of the 2 root words for sex, in the etymology of the word sex. Etymology means where did it come from? One of the words is the word six, and the other word is the word divide. I'm talking about the Latin root words. Okay. 6, what is it? What is 6? The number of man. The division of man. That's what the word sex means. There's 2, male and female. And from the 1500s to the 1800s, every documentation of the word sex is exclusively referring to gender. The distinction between the sexes. The division of the sexes, male and female. Okay. In the 1800s, there was in Russia, there was an article published where a guy was actually arguing for, and I know this is going to sound a bit grotesque, but he was arguing in a publication for the acceptance of bestiality. And in his argumentation, he used the terms for the first time, homosexual and heterosexual. And there's 2 different meanings depending on what you're thinking or where your roots are coming from, okay, in your thinking. These would be, and it was in a Russian publication, it was in Russian, but it would have been translated in English, it would have used those terms. Homo and hetero. What do those words mean? Well, homogeneous doesn't just mean same. Depending on its usage, it can also simply mean one.
Same or one.
Depending on its usage and depending on its etymology, where it's stemming from. And hetero can mean multiple. And that was the context of the usage that he was using, was the idea of some people just have a single type of attraction just to other people, and some people have a multiplicity of attraction, which would include animals.
Wow.
Wait, can you say that again?
No? Go back and listen to the class. I'm not going to get far enough if I... It could be a single attraction just to people, or a multiple attraction, which would include potentially animals. This is in the 1800s. And it was very misunderstood at the time because the average person didn't understand. I mean, what he was trying to present was so outside the norm of thought that it was like it kind of got brushed aside, okay, and later got picked up later, and then used in a different fashion. In the 1920s, in 1920, I think it was 1929, an author by the name of D.H. Lawrence. You ever heard of D.H. Lawrence?
Name sounds familiar.
He was a pornographer. He wrote dirty books, Lady Chatterley's Lover, and so forth. He was banned in many countries. His books were banned because they were pornographic. They described intimate encounters. And it was D.H. Lawrence who actually first used the word sex in a fashion other than as a distinction between male and female. He was the first one to use the word sex as an action word of having sex rather than being a distinct sex. All this stuff matters for comprehension and understanding of this topic. sex went from being the division of mankind into two distinct genders, male and female, to being an activity. Now, the Bible never uses the word sex. It was written far before the word was used in its current iteration. And so we don't see this statement in this word in the Bible, and sometimes people mistakenly will take and say, well, the Bible doesn't use the word sex, therefore it doesn't talk about it. And that's foolishness, really, because the Bible does talk about this, and it talks about all these variations we see today, all of them. It talks about bestiality, it talks about incest, it talks about sodomy, unnatural uses of the man and the woman, and all of those type of things, unnatural affections. All of that's discussed in the Bible, all of it. And so, but it doesn't use the word sex, because that's a modern word. Literally, less than 100 years ago was the first time it was used to describe the intimate relationship between two individuals. The terms in the Bible are different. The term lie with or lay with, right, is used in the Scriptures. Know or knew. Adam knew his wife, right? In chapter number 4. Adam knew Eve in chapter number 4. That's the Bible. That's the first Bible term for intimacy, the very first one. And it's used throughout the Scriptures. It's the one that is mostly used. It's the Bible term that's mostly used in talking about, let me say it this way. All but one instance of it being used, it's in relationship to a husband and wife relationship. There's one instance outside of that. I won't say it's the most prominently used, because probably the terms lay and lie combined are used more frequently than the word know or knew. Okay, he knew. But it's an important term. It's the first term, and as such, it holds a first use meaning and importance. Okay, so what's the importance? The word knew or to know implies more than a simple action. And think about what Paul said in Ephesians, Peter said in 1 Peter chapter number 3, verse number 7, that we're to dwell with them according to knowledge. And he's not talking about having physical relations at that moment. But the reality is that a woman desires to be known. She desires to be known, for someone to know her, to know how she feels, to know how she thinks, to know, her desires, and she wants you to just know, right? As a matter of fact, it's one of the big conflicts between men and women. Women don't want to tell you what they want. They just want you to know. You just are supposed to know it, because that makes her feel like, why? That makes her feel like she is known. Like you know her. And when a woman feels that someone knows her or gets her, if you will, then she's open to being known in a physical sense. She wants to be known emotionally and intellectually before physical. But that's why it's such a beautiful word in the Scriptures. He knew her. Intimately is more than just the action. The word sex is such a base, guttural word. It literally implies nothing more than the activity in our culture. It implies nothing more than that. It reduces the intimate relationship down to just a function of nothing more than an animalistic function. But the Bible words aren't that way. To know, he knew her. That's something beyond just the base guttural function, if you will. And so, semantics here matter. I say all this because understand that Satan doesn't want to use the Bible terms. He doesn't want to use God's terms because they imply more. He wants to debase the relationship, and he wants to debase the activity that was intended by God to have a special and unique place. And he wants to reduce it down to just a transactional action. And he wants to do this with all of intimate relationships and identifications. So you come back around and you start to say, well, the term heterosexual, homosexual, and I mentioned this the other night. When we use those terms, or straight and gay, the Bible doesn't say God made them straight and gay. He made them male and female and told them to be fruitful and multiply. So by nature, there has to be at least the potential that there could be multiplication in this relationship for it to be natural. But to use the term homosexual and imply a same-sex attraction narrative to it, it is an abstract that's foisted onto the vocabulary. And in order to justify its existence, now you have to relabel male and female, and you have to say not natural and unnatural. They don't want to say natural and unnatural. That would be an immediate reproof of their behavior and identification, to say it was unnatural, but that's what the Bible says. And you say, where does it say? It says it in the book of Romans. Just turn over there. Romans, chapter number 1.
Yeah, there's some things I'm gonna have to watch.
I'm not talking fast, guys.
No, you're not, sir, at all. It's comprehension, slowly.
Verse number 23, they changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man, to birds and beasts, and birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. Therefore God gave them up to uncleanness through the lusts of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves. Now he's simply here, that statement could be applied to fornication and adultery and any variation of perversion, okay? Who changed the truth of God into a lie and worshiped and served the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this cause, God gave them up to vile affections. And then notice the statement, even their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature. Natural, unnatural. It's talking about lesbians there, what the modern culture would call lesbianism. Even their women. And it's almost as though it's strange in this statement. It's almost though he's saying, like, I mean, even the women did this. Like, how odd is that? That's the sense of that statement, right? But then he goes in verse 27, he says, likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one toward another, men with men, working that which is unseemly and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error which was meet. Notice the statement though, against nature, the natural use. So sometimes people say, well, I just want to use the Bible term, sodomite. Sodomite. Well, Sodom was a city where certainly there were people that were engaged in unnatural use of the body. But you read the prophets, and what you find out is that God, the judgment of God, that's actually not mentioned in the scriptures when it begins to talk about why was Sodom received the judgment. Okay? Y'all know what I'm talking about?
Sure.
Idleness, abundance of bread. They weren't helping the poor, and they weren't helping the needy, and they were full of bread. They were idle, and all of that type of stuff. And ultimately, it's interesting because in cultures of abundance, the unnatural use of man and woman is far more prevalent. And that's why it's more prevalent in America. When there's abundance, it's always more pervasive. I'm not saying it's not at all in poorer cultures, but it's always more pervasive in abundant cultures. Okay, and that's exactly what God says about it. Go ahead.
You know, Rome was
Rome.
prevalent.
Very
and
much so.
active, and that's why Paul wrote this to
Yep.
Rome, is because of their abundance.
They were filled with abundance. Let me see here.
There you go, think about Rome again.
Ezekiel 16 is what I'm referring to. Go ahead and go back there. Ezekiel 16. In verse number, let's see, verse number 49. This was the iniquity of thy sister Sodom. Pride. That's interesting, isn't it? What is it that they promote? Pride. The pride flag. It's the number one thing the Bible says. Pride, fullness of bread, abundance of idleness was in her and her daughters. Neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and needy. They were haughty, committed abomination before me. Therefore I took them away as I saw good. Notice it, committed abomination is the last statement, not the first. So to say sodomite, well, do we know that Sodom certainly was associated? Yes, certainly it was associated with that. It wasn't the only place that was associated with that, though, in the Scriptures. Okay. And the term is used in the Old Testament, the Sodomites. Okay. That is a term used in the Old Testament. So I'm not saying it's a completely inappropriate term. But to our culture, to the average American who does not read the Bible, does not know the Scriptures, the term sodomite doesn't mean anything. They don't even understand the reference, to be honest. In a Bible culture, you could say it and you'd understand what it means. But I think that it's important to understand that it means far more than just the physical activity. Right? Ezekiel. Yes, it is derogatory. But it is used in the Bible. And I'm not saying it's an inappropriate term. But in counseling, certainly certainly, natural and unnatural is clearly in the Bible. It's natural or it's unnatural. So to accept the term to accept the term homosexual, heterosexual, straight and gay, bi and trans and pan, fluid, all of these type of things. To accept those terms is an exercise in semantics that actually brings legitimacy and justification to something that God says it's simple. It's not complicated. They want to make it complicated. It's not complicated. It's simple. They want to say, oh, gender is complicated. It's not complicated. It's simple. There's two genders, male and female. Now, are there men that are more masculine than other men? Sure. Are there men that manifest absurd attributes of masculinity that we would call machoism? Absolutely. And the same the other direction, aren't there? There's femininity isn't prissiness. You understand what I'm saying? The valley girl, nothing but, vacuous, vain, only concerned about hair and nails and makeup and nothing else. That's an absurdity of femininity. You understand? It's not true femininity. It's the alternate. It's just as skewed as machoism is on the male side. Okay. And so we have to be cautious, but at no point, please get this, at no point is a man ever a female. And the problem is we have attributed mutual attributes that ought to be present in both male and female as being distinctly female, and we've removed positive attributes from masculinity. So that kindness isn't considered to be a masculine attribute, though that's feminine. Well, it's not, it's both. It's not a sexual thing at all. It's something every believer's told to be, kind. Be ye kind one to another if you're feminine. You understand what I'm saying? To make kindness and compassion, to make gratitude and these type of things, to make them a distinction of gender is to pervert them. And that's partly what happens, is that it's like we make simple attributes that ought to be in every one of us. Was Jesus kind? Of course he was. He was compassionate and kind and loving and long-suffering and patient and good. Those aren't masculine or feminine attributes. They're godly attributes. They're attributes every believer ought to have. Was Jesus masculine? 1,000% yes. But that did not negate his kindness or his compassion or his love. Okay? And so you've got to be careful, because what happens with this gender fluidity and this gender spectrum is that they take attributes that ought to be just good attributes and they somehow attribute them to a male-female gender spectrum role, and that's not the case. Every person, male or female, ought to be kind and ought to be compassionate, ought to be loving, ought to be giving, ought to be, caring. All of those things are universal attributes. They're not male or female. Go ahead, Marcus, you have a question.
I had the thought when Jesus had asked who men say that I am, one of the names that was mentioned was Jeremiah, because he wept.
He wept, yeah.
Often. And so that first thought just came into my mind. People attribute that as to some emotionally
that's a
sissy or
female.
whatever.
But see, that's a cultural. There's some cultural things, and American Western culture, because of the perversion of things, has made attributes like that female. boys don't cry, only girls cry. And well, that's foolishness. That's foolishness. It makes things machoism instead of masculine. And we have to make the distinction between those two things. All right? Just like prissy versus female. It's not the same thing. It's not the same thing. Okay. And so, so there's this semantics game that's being played. And the goal is to change the words so much that no one can recognize just what's right and wrong, what's true and false. And that's why the Bible is such a wonderful, wonderful, enduring book. God knew how to write it in a perfect way. Because you know the term that they haven't been able to pervert yet? Natural and unnatural. It didn't say normal and abnormal. Natural and unnatural. That which is congruent with nature and that which is against nature. It's still clear. It's easy to understand. And it's the Bible terminology. And so it's important that we grab hold of that, okay? You have any questions before we move on in now? We're going to move into our main points here. So do you have any questions about just the semantics side and the concept, the Bible foundational, this is what the Bible says about gender and male-female union versus that. And there's other verses we could go to, but I hope that I laid the foundation effectively enough. Go ahead.
So when the pornographer that first used that word, sex, to mean an action, it sounds like this whole thing with semantics kind of took off at that point. And was it academia? Was it?
No, well, no, it was perversion, but I don't know that you can just blame academia. You got to remember that foundationally, the sciences and even the arts were developed by believers. They did science and art because of God. The thoughts of God inspired them to explore His creation, the way in which He established logical progression and reason and math and so forth into the fabric of His creation. It was because man had the idea that there was a rational, logical, knowable God, which is not something present, by the way, in pantheistic and so forth religions. It was because of the Bible presentation that God is knowable and reasonable and logical, and that is what gave the rise to modern scientific exploration and the arts. You go to Europe to any art museum, and the great arts of the past were almost universally religious in nature. Not just concerning the crucifixion and stuff such as that, but just generally speaking, the great artists depicted biblical scenes and those type of things. I mean, that's some of the greatest art in the world.
So it's basically like anything else then. It's simple. The pervert's got a hold
Yeah, of course.
that. And
sin perverts things. Yeah. But, Newton was a believer. Galileo, these were believers who saw reason and rational things and even patterns, and they explored them because they believed it would help them gain a greater understanding of God as well, because they would understand His creation better. And they discovered things. Galileo didn't create gravity, he discovered it. It was already there. But why did he look? Because he believed there was a God that had laid order and structure and law into the universe. So he was looking for the laws of the Creator. Newton wrote the greatest textbook in history on mathematics. And it's the foundation of modern math. Okay. And he was a believer who did so because he believed that God was rational and he could be seen in the, explained in the beauty of mathematical structure, right? And so people come along and pervert that, and they pervert the sciences, which were for the purpose of exploring the greatness of God, and all of the great scientists that they stand on the shoulders of. I mean, they stand on the shoulders of giants. All of those giants, they stand on the shoulders, and they're up here proclaiming, we don't need God. And all of those giants below them did this to demonstrate the greatness of God. It's just, it's unfathomable, really, to think that that they came to that place. But the reality is that science crossed a threshold. It's past a threshold. They can deny God's existence, and they'll continue to try. But we've passed a threshold in science that cannot be gone back on. When they decoded the DNA and found DNA to be a language, a sentence structure, if you will. It's the longest book ever written is your DNA, and it's in every cell of your being, and the cell isn't. See, when early scientists were looking, all they could see was the cell. It looked like a blob. They didn't know what it was. Now they look at the cell and they see the protein factories and the processes of a cell that are have an irreducible complexity to them. Like they all have to be there at the same time, or the cell can't exist. It's not just a blob of material. It's a functioning organism. Each individual cell is, and that they can see that and not understand that there is a logical, rational mind that created it. See, we've crossed the threshold. They can't unsee it. Now they can still deny it. They can't unsee it. There's no way. And at a fairly sizable portion of scientists, more and more are coming to the conclusion that there has to be a creator. There was a point at which there was a, broad general thought of, the earth had no beginning point. That was the original anti-God argument. Always existed. Now they're having to come up with theories that are completely untestable. Multiverse theories and such, because they've proven, science proved that there was a beginning point. Now they I don't think have come to the point where they understand proper testing, because they create confirmation bias in their tests and so forth. But it's interesting because initially the Big Bang was said to be trillions and trillions of years ago, and it's gone from not any beginning to a beginning to, and here's what happened. Here's what's happened over the last 100 years in science. The beginning has gone from none to here to, it keeps getting shorter, it keeps getting closer. You know, it's catching up to truth. It's catching up to truth. But we already have truth.
Yeah.
And the same is true in cultures. See, right now we have this problem, the foolishness of everything got to such a ridiculous extent that in order to be in agreement with the culture on sexuality, you have to believe that a homosexual was born a homosexual from birth, and that's immutable and cannot change. And you have to believe that everyone else is completely gender fluid and can be a man or a woman or attracted to both at any particular time. You have to believe both of those things at the same time. The problem is that they're mutually exclusive. If one's true, the other's false. Okay. So how do you reconcile the two together? How do you reconcile this? Well, the reality is that man can sin and choose sin. And when we're in sin, we can choose all kinds. And sometimes we find a favorite kind. Sometimes we like the variety of sin. And everybody's different. We're still male and female. That's it, male and female. That's what he created. And that's what the Bible brings forth. And so we've reached this tipping point really in our culture where it's not just Christians that are saying this is wrong. As a matter of fact, Christianity, now I don't mean genuine Christians, but Christianity at large is as usual, false religion, as usual, has picked up the perversion and is manifesting so that you have a church down in Texas bringing drag queens in and everyone repeating mantras to the drag queens who they set in the front of the church. This was in Texas 2 weeks ago. Set the drag queens in the front and everyone affirmed them in the church. At the same time, you have scientists and politicians and media personalities coming out and boldly saying, this is not true. This is false. This is wrong. And you have Christian leaders, following the culture. But there is a swing, there's an ebb and a flow and a tipping point to all those things. Okay. And so our job is not to follow the culture. Our job is to find out what God says and then help people see it in reality, help people see the truth of it. So that's what we're getting ready to do. We're going to take our break. When we come back, we're going to start, and we're going to give 8 points that we would deal with. Now, everything I shared with you here just in the last 2 hours is just for foundational understanding. It's not necessarily what you're going to be dealing with these individuals on in a specific manner, although some of it will come into play. Okay, just for comprehension of laying the foundation. What does the Bible actually say? That's what we've been doing the last 2 hours. Okay, let's take our break.
Yeah.